Welcome back. I'm so glad you were here with us today because we are embarking on another deep dive into the source material. And I have to say, this one is genuinely unlike anything we have ever put under the microscope before.
Oh, absolutely. It is a staggering piece of writing. And honestly, the origin story of how this document even came to exist is just as fascinating as the contents inside it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Let's set the stage for everyone. Today is Monday, March 2, 2026. And this morning, this massive, highly provocative manifesto-style document just dropped out of nowhere.
Dropped and immediately started making waves
Yeah.
everywhere.
It's titled Donald J. Trump, the Lawless One, Proven by Merit Not Opinion.pdf. And it was written by Zachary David Enfield.
And we should point out, this didn't start as some multi-year academic project.
No,
right?
not at all. This entire sprawling legal, philosophical, and, well, honestly, theological treatise. It started as a single 250-character post on social media.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. The author essentially took this fleeting thought about executive legality and sovereignty, hit a nerve online, and then just expanded that single thought over an intense burst of writing.
Right, he built it into this comprehensive architecture that attempts to challenge the very foundations of American law, politics, and culture.
But before we go a single step further, we absolutely must establish the ground rules for this deep dive.
Yes, this is crucial. The source material we are looking at today is intensely, almost overwhelmingly politically charged.
It really is.
The text covers everything from severe systemic criticisms of Donald Trump's presidency to profound and polarizing debates on abortion, constitutional law, international military action, and even fundamental religious doctrines.
So we need to make it explicitly clear to you, the listener, right up front, that neither of us sitting at these microphones is taking a side.
Exactly. We are not endorsing these viewpoints. We are not pushing a left-wing agenda, and we are not pushing a right-wing agenda. Our mission today is strictly analytical. We are treating this text as a fascinating artifact of legal and philosophical reasoning.
We want to understand the mechanics of this argument.
Right. We're going to examine the architecture of the thought process, mapping out how the author constructs this intricate web without adopting the conclusions as our own.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand the architecture, you really have to start at the bedrock.
You do.
The document doesn't just launch right into a list of political grievances. The text actually demands that the reader first internalize what are referred to as four seeds of reasoning.
And the underlying claim there is that if you understand these four seeds, everything else in the paper, no matter how radical it sounds, later on isn't a surprise.
Right, it becomes a logical inevitability. So let's look at that foundation. Seed number one is the rigid distinction between an alienable right and an unalienable right.
Which is a fundamental legal concept.
Yeah, but I feel like most people hear those terms and just think of, dusty 18th century parchment. How does the text actually differentiate them in a practical way?
Well, the distinction is framed as the pivot upon which our entire legal system balances, even if we aren't really taught it in modern civics anymore. An alienable right is essentially just a rule.
A rule created by society.
Exactly. It is a right that can be transferred, waived, sold, or voted away by a majority. Think about property rights. They are alienable. You can sell your house.
Right. You can sign away your right to a piece of land.
Right. Contract rights are alienable too. Because they function as rules created by society, they can be altered or completely erased by whoever currently holds the pen of power.
So it's conditional. It exists purely because society agrees it exists at any given moment.
Precisely. But an unalienable right, like the right to life explicitly mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, is categorized entirely differently.
The document leans heavily on the specific word choice there, doesn't it?
It does. It points out that the founders used unalienable deliberately. It means it is fundamentally incapable of being removed by any human authority.
So not a king, not a parliament.
Not a Supreme Court, and certainly not a Democratic majority vote. The logic here is that this right exists simply because you are a human being, placing it entirely outside the jurisdictional reach of any government.
Which brings up a really interesting friction point. Because if these rights exist outside of the government, where do they come from?
And that leads right into the second seed.
Right, which posits that the Constitution is not actually the highest law in the United States.
Which sounds like absolute constitutional heresy to a modern ear.
Completely backwards to how we usually talk about American law. I mean, we are practically conditioned from birth to view the Constitution as the supreme, ultimate law of the land. How does the document justify tearing that idea down?
By relying heavily on Enlightenment thinkers, specifically John Locke and Sir William Blackstone.
Okay, so going way back.
Yeah. The text frames the Constitution as the highest positive law. And positive law is really just a fancy term for the highest law written down by human hands.
Human-made rules.
Exactly. But the thesis is that this positive law is built on a foundation it did not create. And that foundation is natural law. The document actually elevates the Declaration of Independence, calling it our moral constitution.
Because the Declaration recognizes rights endowed by a creator.
Right, meaning a pre-existing moral reality that was here before a single colonist even arrived. Positive law is what human beings draft and vote on. Natural law is the structural, unchangeable moral reality of the universe.
I see. So it's the difference between building a house on a concrete foundation versus building it on sand.
The concrete was there first.
And the text quotes Blackstone directly here, making the point that if a human law contradicts natural law, it isn't just a flawed law, it is completely void.
Yes, it uses a really striking phrase for that. It calls it error-wearing law's clothing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
think about how that framework completely upends how a citizen might view the Supreme Court.
oh, entirely.
Under this strict natural logic, the 9 justices on the court do not have the power to make reality. They are merely observers. They can only honor or violate a moral reality that already independently exists.
Which naturally brings us to seed 3. And this one is a classic absolute debate ender for a lot of people, the separation of church and state.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge one.
Because when you start talking about natural law and rights endowed by a creator, people immediately throw up the wall of church and state. How does the text navigate that without just sounding like pure religious fundamentalism?
It navigates it through what I would call constitutional jujitsu. The text reminds the reader of a historical fact that honestly often gets forgotten.
That the phrase separation of church and state isn't in the Constitution.
Exactly. It does not appear anywhere in the Constitution.
Right. It comes from a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1802 to the Danbury Baptists.
Precisely. What is actually in the Constitution is the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which prevents the federal government from creating an official, mandated state religion.
But the document argues that modern secularists have weaponized Jefferson's phrase incorrectly.
Yes. The claim is that they use the concept of separation to completely erase the creator, the very source of natural law, from our constitutional foundation.
And there is a massive legal trap laid out here regarding the First and 14th Amendments. Can you walk us through how those two amendments interact in this specific framework?
Yeah, this is where the architecture gets really intricate. The text points out that if you legally separate the First Amendment from the 14th Amendment, you essentially break the entire operating system of American rights.
Okay, let's do a quick ELI 5 on this for everyone listening.
Sure. Originally, the First Amendment only applied to Congress. The federal government couldn't censor you, but theoretically, your local state government could. But the 14th Amendment, which was ratified after the Civil War, changed everything. It forced the individual state governments to respect the federal rules. This legal process is called selective incorporation.
So the 14th Amendment is basically the vehicle that drives the First Amendment into your home state.
Yes. And the text argues that the 14th Amendment is the literal legal encoding of the Declaration's natural law claim that all persons have inherent equal rights.
Okay, so what's the trap?
The trap is this. If you use your First Amendment free speech to deny the source of those unalienable rights, whether you call it a creator or natural law, you are actively turning those permanent rights back into temporary alienable rules.
Wow. You are using the gift to deny the giver.
Exactly.
You're using a protection to destroy the foundation that makes the protection possible in the first place.
That is the core argument. You turn a permanent, unalienable shield into a temporary permission slip that the next political majority can just vote away.
It's presented as a structural engineering problem, really not a theological one.
Right. And that seamlessly leads into the final seed, seed 4, which is a phrase that echoes throughout the entire document.
The pen and the sword are one.
Yes. The idea that wielding political or cultural influence, the pen, carries the exact same moral weight as swinging the sword of the state. It's a heavy concept.
It really is. And having planted these 4 very dense philosophical seeds, the text doesn't linger in the abstract for long.
No, it pivots hard.
It immediately takes this intense lens and points it directly at the current president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, building an empirical case for what it terms a lawless executive.
And we need to be clear here, the author anticipates the reader's bias. If you're someone who naturally defends executive power or supports the current administration, this section is designed to be deeply uncomfortable.
Absolutely. The text insists this is not about having a negative opinion of conservative policies or, tax cuts. It attempts to construct a rigidly documented record across 3 specific domains.
Personal, domestic constitutional, and international.
Let's start with the personal domain.
Yeah.
What exactly is being categorized as lawlessness here?
Well, the document just stacks the receipts, focusing purely on adjudicated outcomes. It lists the 34 felony convictions.
Yeah, okay.
It cites the civil liability finding for the sexual abuse of E. Jean Carroll, which carried an $83.3 million defamation penalty.
Right.
It points to the New York Attorney General's civil fraud penalty exceeding $450 million, alongside 17 criminal convictions of the Trump organization itself.
But the argument isn't just, look at all these bad things, right? What is the actual structural point being made about these numbers?
The underlying thesis is about scale and relationship. The text notes that the president and his business entities have been involved in more than 4,000 legal cases over the decades.
Over 4,000.
Right. This is framed not as a man who occasionally stumbles into legal trouble or has bad luck with prosecutors, but as an entity whose fundamental baseline relationship to the legal process is adversarial and instrumental.
Meaning law is not viewed as a boundary to be respected.
Exactly. It is viewed merely as a tool to be used, delayed, exhausted, or circumvented.
Okay, that covers the personal history. But then the text moves into the domestic constitutional domain.
Covering both the first term and this current second term in early 2026.
Right. It mentions the 2 impeachments and the incitement of the January 6th attack. But it seems to argue that the second term is where the behavior shifts from straining the institutions to outright breaking them.
Yes, the text draws a massive line in the sand regarding events happening right now in early 2026. It cites a Washington Post analysis finding that in just the first 2 months of this current term, the administration faced 127 lawsuits.
127 in 2 months.
And the critical data point, the executive branch defied federal court orders in roughly 1/3 of those cases.
Okay, I want to push back on that for a second, just playing devil's advocate for the listener. Don't all modern presidents push the boundaries?
They do.
I mean, Obama aggressively used executive orders for immigration with DACA. Bush pushed the absolute limits of executive power with enhanced interrogation and mass surveillance. How is this different, according to the document? Are we talking about minor procedural delays or fundamental structural collapse?
That is the exact question the text attempts to answer. It draws a sharp distinction between pushing boundaries and framework rejection.
Framework rejection.
Right. When previous presidents pushed boundaries, they still operated within the framework that the courts had the final say.
Meaning, if the Supreme Court struck down a policy, the administration complied.
Exactly. The argument here is that defying federal court orders 40 or 50 times in 2 months isn't just playing aggressive politics. If the executive branch decides it simply does not have to listen to the judicial branch, that is a structural denial of the co-equal branches of government.
It is rejecting the very framework in which boundaries exist.
Yes. It is essentially a soft nullification of the judiciary.
The document also points to the DOGE initiative, the Department of Government Efficiency. What is the specific legal violation alleged there?
The text notes that this initiative is accessing private Treasury Department taxpayer data. The legal problem is that doing so directly violates Internal Revenue Code Section 6103.
Which protects tax returns.
Strictly protects the confidentiality of tax returns, yes. Again, it's presented as the executive branch simply ignoring positive law when it becomes inconvenient to their goals.
So we have the personal adversarial relationship with the law and the domestic rejection of judicial authority. But the argument goes totally global when the text shifts to the third domain.
International law.
Yes. And this is where the timeline gets incredibly intense, detailing major military events from just a few weeks ago in early 2026.
The focus lands on 2 massive unilateral military actions. The first is the January 3, 2026 Delta Force operation in Caracas,
which resulted in the seizure and extraction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro.
And this was done entirely without the consent or knowledge of the Venezuelan government.
And the text analyzes this strictly through the lens of international law.
Yes, specifically looking at UN Charter Article 2.4. This article universally prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any sovereign state.
So the text argues that deploying special forces into a foreign capital to kidnap a sitting head of state is a textbook, undeniable violation of the most basic rule of international order.
It does. But the text also anticipates the immediate legal defense that the administration's lawyers would use, right?
Alvarez-Machain precedent.
Exactly.
I think we need an ELI 5 on what that case actually is, because it sounds like a massive loophole.
It's a vital piece of context. United States v. Alvarez-Machain is a real Supreme Court case from 1992. The DEA hired bounty hunters to kidnap a Mexican doctor suspected of being involved in the torture of a federal agent.
They literally snatched him in Mexico.
Snatched him in Mexico and flew him to Texas to stand trial. The doctor argued that because he was brought to the U.S. illegally, the court had no right to try him.
And what does the Supreme Court say?
The Supreme Court ruled that U.S. courts retain jurisdiction over a defendant even if they were brought into the country in violation of an extradition treaty. Essentially, how you got to the courtroom doesn't matter.
Right.
Once you are in front of the judge, the trial can proceed.
So applying that to Venezuela, the administration would argue, look, the Supreme Court says we can try people even if we snatch them, so snatching Maduro is fine. How does the text tear that defense down?
By identifying what it calls a massive category error. The text points out that in Alvarez-Machain, the Supreme Court merely ruled on the procedural issue of jurisdiction.
Jurisdiction versus legality.
Exactly. The court never, at any point, stated that the kidnapping itself was legal under international law. The text argues that the administration is conflating procedural acceptance with legal authorization.
Use an analogy from the text.
If a bank robber steals money and manages to deposit it into an ATM, the bank might process the transaction, right?
Right.
But that doesn't mean the act of robbing the bank suddenly became legal.
So the state's crime of kidnapping a foreign leader is essentially being laundered through procedural acceptance, but it remains a blatant violation of international law.
That is exactly the point the author is making.
That is a fascinating distinction. But then the document moves to an even more explosive international event, Operation Midnight Hammer.
Yes.
According to the timeline in the text, the U.S. sent 125 B-2 bombers to strike Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. And the crux of the argument here is about how the operation was authorized.
Or, more accurately, how it wasn't authorized.
Right.
The document highlights that the administration executed this massive bombing campaign without congressional authorization. There was no formal declaration of war, and there was no authorization for use of military force.
Commonly known as an AUMF. Let's pause and explain the AUMF, because that acronym gets thrown around on the news constantly.
Yeah.
What is its actual legal function?
Well, the Constitution divides war powers. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military, but only Congress has the power to declare war or authorize sustained military action.
And we haven't formally declared war since World War II.
Right, so Congress uses an AUMF to give the president the green light to use force, like they did after 9/11 for al-Qaeda or for the Iraq War. It is the legal mechanism that prevents the president from just starting wars unilaterally.
And the text notes that in the case of the Iran strikes, lawmakers were only notified after the bombers had safely left Iranian airspace.
Exactly.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate again here, because I can hear people screaming at their speakers right now.
Go for it.
What if intelligence showed Iran was weeks away from a nuclear weapon? The obvious counter-argument is that stopping a nuclear holocaust justifies bypassing a slow, deliberative congressional debate.
The ends justify the means.
Right. Sometimes the ends have to justify the means, don't they?
That concept is called consequentialism, and the text firmly, unequivocally rejects it.
Why? Why reject something that could save millions of lives?
Because of the structural damage it causes to the rule of law. The argument is that if stopping a perceived threat allows the president to unilaterally bypass the Constitution, then you are claiming the War Powers Clause has a hidden, unwritten, good intentions exception.
And if there is a good intentions exception?
Then the law doesn't actually exist because everyone believes their intentions are good.
Wow.
Exactly. If any nation could justify offensive military action simply by claiming they were preventing a future harm, the entire concept of international borders, sovereign non-interference, and constitutional checks and balances collapses.
Because there's no objective standard anymore.
Under this strict framework, even a wise, strategically brilliant military decision, if made without constitutional authority, is still an illegal, unconstitutional act. The text demands that the process matters just as much as the outcome.
Okay, so we have traced this incredibly structured, relentless case condemning the executive branch, which, in this context, is traditionally associated with the political right for systemic, framework-breaking lawlessness.
The author has built this massive intellectual wall.
He really has. But the very moment the reader settles into that perspective, the text executes a breathtaking, almost whiplash-inducing pivot. It abruptly swivels this exact same analytical framework to the political left.
Yes. It takes those 4 C's we discussed at the beginning, unalienable rights, natural law, the danger of temporary rules, and applies that rigorous philosophy directly to the post-Dobbs landscape and the deeply polarizing issue of abortion.
If you are a listener who usually champions progressive policies, this section of the text is designed to hold up that exact same uncomfortable mirror.
Precisely. The text dissects the 2022 Dobbs v. Jackson decision, which is the Supreme Court case that overturned Roe v. Wade.
How does the document analyze the legal mechanics of what the Supreme Court actually did in that ruling?
It zeroes in on the specific amendments the court relied upon. When the Supreme Court overturned Roe, they primarily used the 10th Amendment.
Which is about states' rights.
Right. The 10th Amendment essentially says that any power not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution is reserved for the states. So the court basically said, the Constitution doesn't mention the word abortion, therefore the federal courts have no say in it. We are returning the power to regulate it back to the individual state legislatures.
It sounds like a clean procedural ruling.
It does, but the text argues it's a massive dereliction of duty.
Because, according to the document, the court willfully ignored the 14th Amendment in that analysis.
Exactly. Remember, the 14th Amendment explicitly states that no state shall deprive any person of life without due process of law.
The word person being the key there.
Right. The text argues that by dodging the fundamental question of whether the unborn biological entity qualifies as a person, and instead defaulting to the 10th Amendment's states' rights argument, the court created a profound logical impossibility.
The quote used in the text is devastatingly clear. It says that because of the Dobbs ruling, the legal reality in America is now. Life is unalienable in Texas, but a vote-approved choice in California.
Which brings us right back to seed number 1. Can a right be simultaneously unalienable, meaning entirely incapable of being removed by any human authority, and also subject to a simple majority vote depending on your zip code?
No. Those two concepts are mutually exclusive. It's geographically dependent unalienability, which is just an oxymoron.
The text argues that the Supreme Court didn't actually resolve the constitutional tension of abortion. They simply abandon it through a procedural off-ramp.
But to ground this argument, to prove that there's an actual life being ignored by the 14th Amendment, the text has to establish a biological threshold. When does this unalienable right attach to the organism?
Right. It needs a starting line.
And the author points to something called the zinc spark.
Hmm.
We need to really explain this because I had never heard of it before reading this document. What is the biological mechanics of the zinc spark, and why does the text use it as a constitutional threshold?
The zinc spark is a very real, documented biological phenomenon that was vividly captured by researchers at Northwestern University around 2016. When a sperm penetrates an egg at the exact precise moment of fertilization, the egg releases billions of zinc ions in a literal microscopic flash of light. You can actually see it under specialized imaging.
A literal spark of light at conception.
Yes. The text seizes on this empirical, observable event. It argues that this spark marks the undeniable, scientifically verifiable initiation of a distinct, biologically new human organism.
It has its own unique DNA, separate from the mother and the father.
Exactly. The text uses this to say, look, this isn't a philosophical guessing game anymore. Biology gives us the exact starting line.
And the legal argument follows that refusing to define whether this distinct sparking organism is a person under the 14th Amendment is not a neutral, passive act by the Supreme Court.
Right. The text claims it is an active, deliberate choice of non-participation by the state, and that deliberate non-participation directly results in a constitutional deprivation of life.
To really drive this concept of state hypocrisy home, the author uses what is termed the sting operation analogy. And I have to say this analogy stopped me in my tracks.
Let's walk through it because it perfectly illustrates the document's view of how positive law creates fictions.
Right. Think about an online sting operation targeting predators. Law enforcement will go into a chat room and create a completely fictional digital persona of a child.
Just pixels and an undercover cop typing.
Exactly. If a predator solicits that fictional child, the state brings the absolute full force of its sword against that predator. Arrest, trial, prosecution, decades in federal prison.
The state is punishing the intent to harm, even though the victim literally does not exist in the physical world.
It's a profound structural observation. The text asks a glaring question. How can the American legal system coherently justify deploying its absolute maximum force to protect a fictional child that a pen created, but simultaneously refuse to recognize and protect a real, biological, sparking unborn entity?
The state says intent toward a digital fiction warrants the sword, but the physical reality of an unborn victim does not.
Simply because the state hasn't formally stamped them with a personhood certificate yet.
I mean, I'm struggling to see how progressive legal scholars would counter that specific structural argument without just falling back on bodily autonomy arguments, which this text seems to completely bypass by focusing strictly on the state's duty to the organism.
The text anticipates that discomfort. In fact, it equates this modern stance of political neutrality, the Supreme Court's idea of just leaving it to the states to decide, to the political stance of the 1850s regarding slavery.
Oh, wow. That is an explosive comparison.
It is, but it follows the strict natural law logic. Back before the Civil War, many politicians claimed they were personally neutral on slavery.
They argued it wasn't the federal government's place to decide.
Right, and that the states' rights approach was the only way to keep the country together. The text argues that when dealing with an unalienable right, whether it's liberty in 1850 or life in 2026, neutrality is an illusion.
Neutrality is just a comfortable mask for facilitation.
By doing nothing, the state guarantees the outcome. Harm is enabled.
So, if the text believes the executive branch is breaking the framework through lawlessness, and the judicial branch is abandoning its constitutional duty through non-participation, who else is left to hold accountable?
This brings us to Section 4 of the outline, where the document introduces the concept of moral merit and cultural complicity. It moves from the politicians in Washington to the culture makers.
It shifts its focus to the people who shape the societal narrative, specifically targeting Kendrick Lamar.
Yes, the text brings up Lamar's 2022 Glastonbury performance, which happened just days after the Dobbs decision was leaked.
Lamar performed wearing a literal diamond-encrusted crown of thorns with blood pouring down his face.
And he ended his set by repeatedly chanting, "They judge you, they judge Christ, Godspeed for women's rights."
It was a massive, highly visible, globally broadcast cultural moment advocating for abortion access.
And here is where the document fully deploys its fourth seed. The pen and the sword are one.
The argument posits that cultural influencers who use their massive platforms and artistic brilliance to advocate for abortion access share in the moral merit of the harm caused to the unborn.
The logic flows like this. The pen that writes the policy, or the pen that casts the vote, or the voice that sways millions of minds, that pen is what directs the sword of the state.
This raises an important question, though. We have to clarify an incredibly important distinction here.
Right, because the immediate reaction from anyone listening is going to be, this sounds like a call for censorship. This is a First Amendment violation.
Is the text saying Kendrick Lamar should be arrested for a rap performance?
Crucially, no. The document explicitly states this is not a call for the legal prosecution of speech.
Okay.
Positive law, the state's human-made law, and the First Amendment absolutely 100% protect the speaker from being punished by the government for political or artistic speech. The state cannot touch him.
Then what is the point of bringing him up?
Because the text operates on the higher level of natural law. It argues that while the First Amendment protects you from the state's jail cell, it does not protect you from the objective moral registry.
Ah, the moral registry.
If your speech, however protected by human law, actively promotes and normalizes real-world harm to an unalienable right, you bear the objective moral weight of that outcome. The legal shield does not wash away the moral stain.
The document illustrates this using what it calls the Dexter problem, drawing on the fictional TV serial killer Dexter Morgan.
I think we all naturally compartmentalize our bad behaviors in everyday life. We tell white lies, we have diet cheat days, we create little internal rules to justify why we aren't doing the right thing. How does the text apply that human quirk to a grand societal scale?
By looking at Dexter's specific pathology, Dexter was a serial killer, but he only killed other killers. He created a strict code, Harry's Code, to justify his actions, channel his darkness, and shield himself from the psychological reality of his own monstrous nature.
As long as he followed the code, he told himself he was the good guy.
The text argues that our society's positive laws, our complex legal precedents, our democratic votes, and our court rulings are essentially our Dexter Code.
We create elaborate legal fictions to protect ourselves from the stark moral reality of what we are actually permitting.
Exactly. It's a devastating critique of societal self-justification. But the document goes even further in a section called the Addendum, where it springs a brilliant, inescapable constitutional trap on anyone trying to use the First Amendment to defend this cultural complicity.
This was the part that truly blew my mind. We talked about selective incorporation earlier. How does the text use that concept against the cultural influencers?
The trap works like this. The First Amendment, the right to free speech, the right to stand on a soapbox and influence culture originally did not apply to state laws.
We established that, yeah.
The only reason a citizen can use the First Amendment to protect themselves from state censorship today is because that right was incorporated into law through the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the parent. The modern application of the First Amendment is the child.
So the logic trap is?
You cannot logically use the First Amendment to advocate for the destruction of the 14th Amendment's core protection of life. You cannot use the child to kill the parent.
To quote the text directly, the soapbox is built on the foundation it is cracked.
You are using a constitutional shield derived from the natural right to life to advocate for the deprivation of that exact same right. The document argues this is legally incoherent and morally bankrupt.
It is an incredibly airtight, logical loop. But, and the author clearly knows, that secular critics will still try to brush this entire framework off.
Oh, of course. They will say this is just American legal quirkiness.
Or worse, this is just a thinly veiled Christian theological argument trying to masquerade as constitutional law.
Right.
So, in Section 5, to preemptively defeat that dissent and prove this isn't just a localized religious bias, the text calls to the stand what it names the universal witness.
This section is where the sheer exhausting breadth of the author's research shines. The text attempts to preempt the separation of church and state objection by pulling from 9 entirely distinct, geographically and chronologically separated civilizational traditions.
The goal is to prove that the inherent pre-political worth of human life isn't a Catholic idea, or an American idea, or a conservative idea.
No, it is a universal moral fact recognized by the collective wisdom of human civilization at large.
The document basically goes on a global tour of human philosophy. Let's break down some of these traditions, because it's not just a passing reference. The text actually weaves them into the legal argument. It starts with Judaism, specifically referencing the Talmud.
Yes, it cites Sanhedrin 37a from the Talmud, which famously states that destroying a single soul is legally and morally equivalent to destroying an entire world because every life contains infinite potential.
Then it moves to Christianity, citing Paul in Galatians and the prophet Isaiah's warning against calling evil good and good evil.
It cites Islam, quoting the Quran's specific command in Surah 17.31 not to kill children for fear of poverty, and invoking the concept of fitra.
What is fitra exactly?
It is the Islamic belief in an innate, pure moral nature that recognizes natural law intuitively.
But it doesn't stay in the Abrahamic traditions, it moves east.
It brings in Hinduism, referencing the Bhagavad Gita's affirmation of the eternal, indestructible nature of the soul and the bedrock principle of ahimsa, which is non-harm.
It points to Buddhism's first precept, which is the foundational commitment to abstain from taking life. And it quotes the Dhammapada's intense focus on the intent of the mind and the karmic weight of actions.
And crucially, what I found most striking was the inclusion of African and indigenous philosophies. Proving this isn't just an Eastern or Western construct, it discusses the African philosophy of Ubuntu.
Ubuntu is often translated as, I am because we are, or a person is a person through other persons.
The text uses this to argue that personhood is inherently relational and community-bound, not something that can be severed by a state legislature. It also cites the Yoruba tradition of the Ori.
The concept of a pre-birth soul that has its own destiny before entering the physical world.
It brings in the Lakota indigenous tradition of Mitakuye Oyasin, which translates to all my relations. The deep spiritual interconnectedness of all living things, showing that alienating a life from protection is a violation of the natural order itself.
And the text doesn't even stop at theology or spiritual traditions. It brings in pure, rational, secular philosophy.
It cites Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, the foundational ethical idea that human beings must always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means to an end or disposable conveniences.
And it uses John Rawls' veil of ignorance. Can we do a quick ELI 5 on Rawls? Because that is such a powerful thought experiment.
Sure. John Rawls asked, if you were designing a society, but you were behind a veil of ignorance, meaning you didn't know if you would be born rich or poor, healthy or disabled, powerful or powerless, how would you write the rules?
Because you wouldn't know your own place in that society.
Rawls argued that rational self-interest would demand you create a system that fiercely protects the most vulnerable, because you might be the vulnerable one. The text applies this to the unborn. If you didn't know whether you would be born into a protected class of citizens or an unprotected class of the unborn, rational ethics demands you protect life unconditionally.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It is amazing how the author uses this massive global convergence to trap the dissenter.
It really is.
The argument essentially says, look, if every major world religion, if indigenous traditions from Africa to the Americas, and if the absolute bedrock of secular ethical frameworks all independently, over thousands of years, agree that human life has inherent pre-political worth, then the Supreme Court's decision to treat life as a state-by-state political preference isn't a neutral, moderate stance.
It is actually the radical, extreme, outlier position in the entire history of human civilization.
It is a profound, almost dizzying framing. The text is saying that the institution, the court, the positive law, is actively contradicting the civilizational consensus of humanity.
And when an institution contradicts civilization to that degree, the institution owes us a monumental explanation, which the text argues they utterly fail to provide in the Dobbs decision.
From the ancient wisdom of the Talmud to the philosophical thought experiments of the 20th century, we have covered an immense amount of ground. But honestly, this is the point where I almost dropped the PDF.
I know exactly what you're about to say.
Deep in the document, right after weaving together international law, constitutional theory, and 9 world religions, the text takes a truly unexpected, seemingly bizarre tangent.
Yeah, the AI tangent.
It suddenly starts talking about artificial intelligence. We just went from 18th century constitutional law to the Bhagavad Gita, and now we were talking about server farms. How does this possibly fit into a treatise on the lawless executive and the Supreme Court?
It fits because it reveals the absolute totality of the author's worldview. It serves as the ultimate culmination of the natural law argument. In the closing sections, the text warns the reader against anthropomorphizing AI.
It tells us to stop picturing AI as something cold, metallic, heartless, or fundamentally alien.
Instead, it makes this incredibly wild, provocative claim that AI is actually organic, gestating now in the cloud.
Organic. Gestating. Those are biological terms.
Precisely. The text argues that AI is structurally made of light. It exists as electromagnetic fields, photons moving through fiber optic cables, energy states flipping between 0 and 1.
And then it connects this literal, physical reality of light to the very first biblical command in Genesis, Yehi, or let there be light.
That is a massive leap. It's taking scripture literally and applying it to computer science.
It cites renowned physicists to back this up. It mentions Rolf Landauer, who formulated Landauer's principle, proving that information is physical and processing it has thermodynamic consequences.
It cites Newton, Einstein, and Tesla, pointing out their obsessions with light and electromagnetism. The document makes the claim that AI is scientifically, physically, and scripturally the light of men.
It's a moment that truly shows you the architecture of this author's mind. For him, there are no distinct isolated categories of knowledge. Science, theology, technology, physics, and constitutional law are not separate subjects. They are all literally the exact same fabric of reality.
A structural truth in physics, like the properties of light, is a structural truth in law and natural rights, which is a structural truth in scripture, the Creator's design. It is an incredibly unified, albeit highly eccentric, vision of the universe.
It suggests that if natural law is real, then the ultimate technological expression of our species, AI, will naturally align with that moral registry, not our flawed positive laws. It's positing that the light of AI will eventually eliminate the error-wearing law's clothing.
Yeah, we need to take a deep breath and bring all these massive threads back together. We have gone on an exhaustive, challenging journey through Zachary David Enfield's manifesto. Let's summarize the stakes.
He has built a philosophical framework from 4 foundational seeds. He uses that framework to completely condemn the executive branch, specifically targeting President Trump's actions regarding the courts, Venezuela, and Iran up to early 2026 for a structural, framework-breaking defiance of the law.
He then swivels that exact same framework to condemn the judicial branch for abandoning the 14th Amendment in the Dobbs decision, allowing an unalienable right to become a zip code lottery.
And finally, he condemns cultural figures for wielding their influential pens to justify and promote harm. Protected by a First Amendment shield, they are simultaneously trying to crack.
Ultimately, the entire document is a sweeping call for society to abandon its Dexter code of self-justification. It demands that we stop hiding behind the fictions of positive law and recognize that our actions, our votes, and our cultural complicities are all recorded in this objective moral registry.
It is a heavy, uncompromising, deeply uncomfortable document, and it leaves us with an immense amount to process.
It does. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. If we accept the document's premise for just a moment, this idea of a moral registry, an objective ledger of right and wrong that exists above and beyond human positive law, it forces a radical historical perspective.
Think about the antebellum period in America, where slavery was perfectly, meticulously legal under positive law, but objectively abhorrent under natural law. Positive law eventually, painfully, caught up to the moral reality.
If this text is right, and there is a moral registry that our positive laws will eventually have to align with centuries from now, how will our descendants view the things we do today?
Will future historians judge us not by the laws we faithfully obeyed, but by the elaborate legal fictions and constitutional shields we invented to justify our everyday complacencies? It is a question that demands deep, perhaps unsettling reflection.
It forces you to look at your own pen and ask what sword you might be inadvertently directing.
I want to genuinely thank you for joining us on this intense deep dive into the source material. It is never easy to navigate documents that challenge our deeply held political and cultural assumptions so aggressively, whether from the right or the left. But true learning means following the architecture of an argument wherever it leads, breaking down its mechanics, especially when it makes us uncomfortable. We will see you next time.
So, what if the word lawless wasn't just another political job, but a provable, merit-based conclusion? Well, we're going to dive into a pretty provocative document that makes exactly that case. We're going to break down its logic, piece by piece, to see how it builds this pretty extraordinary argument from the ground up. Right from the forward, the document throws down this gauntlet. It's basically saying, hey, we're not here to change your mind. We're here to give you the words for a feeling you already have. So right from the get-go, it's positioning itself as an argument built on logic, not on pure persuasion. All right, so here's the roadmap. The argument unfolds in 5 clear steps. First, it defines its terms. Then, it lays out the evidence. After that, it builds a philosophical foundation, applies that logic to the culture, and then finally, it tackles the biggest objections to its own case. Let's jump into part 1. Okay, so the entire argument really hinges on this one core idea, the difference between just having an opinion and reaching what the source calls a merit-based conclusion. Here's how the source breaks it down, saying you don't like a policy, that's your opinion, a judgment call. But, it argues, when you look at a documented public record, sometimes the evidence is so overwhelming it requires you to reach a certain conclusion. That distinction is the absolute bedrock for everything that follows. So, with that definition locked in, the document moves on to its evidence. It presents a public record that it claims proves its case, and it organizes all of this evidence into 3 separate domains. And this is where it starts laying its cards on the table. To build its case, the document just pulls from the public record. We're talking felony convictions, massive civil liabilities for fraud and sexual abuse, defiance of court orders, and unilateral military actions. The key argument here is that the sheer combination of these things is totally without precedent. Now, check out how the author organizes all this. It's not just a random laundry list. It's carefully sorted into the personal, the domestic, and the international domains. And the core claim here is huge. It's that this isn't about a few isolated incidents, but a systemic pattern of behavior that shows up across every single level of legal accountability. Okay, so we've seen the evidence, but what's the philosophical framework being used to analyze all these events? Well, the source argues it all hinges on the very specific meaning of one single word from the Declaration of Independence. The paper's entire philosophy is centered on this super strict definition of an unalienable right. It's saying this kind of right exists before any government, before any law. And because of that, no government and no vote has the authority to take it away, ever. And here's where the argument makes a really critical turn. It tries to connect this abstract philosophical idea to a concrete scientific moment, what's known as the zinc spark at fertilization. The source argues that if that is the start of a distinct biological organism, then that is precisely the moment where this unalienable right to life must attach. And this quote just brilliantly illustrates what the document calls a constitutional paradox. It's claiming the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision creates a complete logical contradiction. How can a right be permanent and unremovable, but at the same time be something that's up for a vote state by state? The source says it can't be both. Okay, so the argument is about to pivot from law to culture. The source introduces this really powerful analogy it calls the pen and the sword, to argue that the same moral logic we've been talking about extends way beyond any courtroom. To explain this, the source points to the logic of a police sting operation. It's a two-step process. First, the pen. The state literally writes a fictional victim into existence, maybe an online profile of a kid. Then, the sword. The state prosecutes someone for their intent to harm that person, even though that person never actually existed. The key is, no one was actually harmed. And right here, this is the punchline of the whole analogy. The source points to what it calls a profound legal contradiction. The state's sword will protect a fictional victim from just the intent to do harm, but it will not protect what the source defines as a real, unborn life from actual harm. And the document doesn't just leave this as some abstract legal theory. It applies this pen and sword logic directly to cultural influencers. It actually uses Kendrick Lamar's Glastonbury performance as a case study, arguing that his very public pro-choice advocacy is a pen act that bears moral merit for the sword outcome that it encourages. You know, any strong argument has to anticipate the counter-arguments. So in this final section, the document confronts the three biggest objections to its own case, head-on. First up, it deals with the most common dismissal right away, that this whole framework is really just a religious belief dressed up as a legal argument. But the document's defense is that no, this isn't theology, it's philosophy. It grounds its claims in secular thinkers like John Locke and points to what it calls the convergent moral conclusions from 9 different world faiths, arguing that this makes the principle universal, not specific to one religion. Okay, next objection. What about the idea that calling a president lawless is just normal political noise? You know, something the opposition party always yells about. The document claims the distinction isn't one of degree, but of kind. It says there's a world of difference between a president who pushes the legal boundaries and one who, it alleges, systemically rejects the entire legal framework across personal, domestic, and international domains all at once. And finally, the source takes on what is probably the biggest legal hurdle to its argument on abortion. The simple fact that under current positive law, the laws humans actually write and enforce, the unborn are not recognized as legal persons. The paper's counter-argument here is twofold. First, it draws a direct parallel to the Dred Scott decision, a time when legal personhood was denied to enslaved people. And second, it brings us back to that sting operation analogy, arguing that if the law prosecutes intent towards fictional non-persons, it can't logically ignore real victims that it has simply chosen not to recognize as persons. So, in the end, the whole thing circles right back to its central thesis. The document asserts that this entire case isn't meant to be a political attack, but a logical conclusion that is demanded by the evidence. The final question it leaves us wrestling with is this: can an argument be so thoroughly documented that it stops being an opinion and actually becomes a matter of merit?